The hollers of Kentucky hold many secrets, but none whispered as fiercely as the tale of Clara Mae Hensley, the girl who became a bride long before she became a woman. Folks still say the woods remember her footsteps, that the wind shifts when someone speaks her name, as if the land itself still fears what she became. It began on a night soaked in moonlight, when the trees leaned in close and the air hung heavy with a kind of silence that felt watched. Clara, no bigger than a shadow, walked barefoot behind her brother as he led her through the crooked pines. Lantern light flickered across their faces, carving strange shapes into the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply followed, because that was what every girl in her family had been taught to do when the elders summoned her. Hidden deep where the path turned cold and the soil grew black, a ring of stones waited for them. The old midwife, with her trembling hands and milky eyes, stood ready to bless a marriage no one in their right mind would witness. And yet, it happened, quietly, illegally, unforgivably, beneath a sky that seemed to dim the stars in shame. They say the woods shifted that night. Animals fled without sound. The river stilled. Even the crickets stopped their song. By dawn, the midwife was gone. By dusk, Clara's gaze had changed, still, empty, as if part of her had been left behind in that circle of stones. And by the end of the week, the first strange scream echoed through the holler, sharp enough to slice through the trees, sending every man, woman, and child bolting their doors. No one dared ask what truly happened that night. No one dared approach the Hensley cabin. The forbidden ceremony began long before Clara Mae ever stepped into the clearing, woven into the fabric of her bloodline like a curse no one dared challenge. In the Hensley family, tradition wasn't something spoken aloud, it pressed down on every generation with a weight that felt older than the mountains themselves. Clara had grown up watching the silent exchanges between her elders, looks that carried warning, agreements made without words, rules she was expected to obey long before she understood them. At 13, she already knew her future was not hers to choose, though she didn't yet grasp the darkness waiting for her in the woods. On the night of the ceremony, she sensed it. Everyone did. The air was unnaturally still when the elders gathered her from her room, their candles throwing unsteady shadows across the peeling walls. She didn't resist as they wrapped her in a threadbare white dress that had been worn by brides in the family for generations, a dress that carried stains no washing could remove. Eli, her brother, waited by the door, his face unreadable, though his hands shook slightly. He was older by only a few years, but already burdened by the knowledge of what was expected of him. Neither spoke as they were led outside, where the darkness swallowed them whole. The path they followed wound through the trees like a scar, known only to those born into the Hensley name. Lanterns swung from the elders' hands, barely illuminating the twisted roots and wild undergrowth, while the woods around them seemed to hum with an awareness that felt almost hostile. Clara walked in Eli's shadow, aware of every crunch of leaves beneath her feet, each sound amplified in the heavy quiet. She had heard stories about the clearing they were approaching, tales whispered by cousins who giggled nervously, not understanding the gravity behind their words. A place where the Hensleys completed rituals they never spoke of after. When they reached the stone circle, Clara felt the temperature drop sharply. The midwife stood waiting, her back slightly bent, her eyes clouded but watchful. She carried a small, leather-bound book and a bundle wrapped in animal hide. The elders positioned Clara and Eli within the ring, their faces expressionless, their movements practiced. Clara's chest tightened, not from fear alone but from an instinctive recognition that something irreversible was about to happen, something that would bind her not just to Eli but to the land itself. The midwife's voice rose in a wavering chant. Eli reached for Clara's hand, his grip cold, uncertain. The flames around them flickered, bending as if pushed by breath. Clara felt the woods listening, leaning closer, echoing the words that sealed their forbidden union. The whispering trees became the first sign that something had gone wrong after the secret ceremony, though most folks in the holler claimed the woods had always carried murmurs if you listened long enough. Still, the sounds changed in tone after Clara Mae's marriage night, taking on a strange, pleading quality that unsettled even the bravest men who hunted along the ridgeline. At first, the whispers were faint, little more than a rustle of leaves that seemed to trail behind those who passed too close, like footsteps matching their pace. People brushed it off as superstition, as tricks of a tired mind, but no one could deny that the woods felt different, heavier, as if holding a secret too large for the trees to bear. Children were the first to complain. They returned from berry picking with wide eyes, swearing the forest called their names in voices that didn't belong to anyone they knew. Some said they heard a young girl sobbing somewhere deep beyond the pines, her cries carried on a cold breeze even in the heat of July. Others spoke of a soft humming, sad, weary, and coming from everywhere at once. Parents tried to quiet their fears, but even they felt uneasy when the wind shifted and seemed to whisper back. Stranger still, the voices always grew sharper near the Hensley property. Travelers passing through would quicken their pace as they approached the sagging fence line, claiming the whispers rose to a chorus there, overlapping, urgent, like a warning meant for anyone bold enough to linger. A few swore they heard the sound of small hands tapping against bark, as if something inside the trees wanted out. No one admitted it openly, but everyone knew the timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The voices began the morning after Clara's forbidden union, and they only grew stronger in the days that followed. Women in the holler shared stories behind closed doors, remembering past generations and the strange fate that always seemed to follow the Hensley brides. They recalled nights when the woods groaned like a living thing and mornings when the fog clung to the earth long after sunrise, refusing to lift. Some believed the whispers came from spirits trapped by the sins of the family, forced to wander among the roots and branches, doomed to repeat the same cries for eternity. Others suspected something darker, that the land itself had absorbed the wrongdoing and was speaking back in a voice only the guilty could fully understand. No one dared confront the Hensleys directly. Instead, they avoided the woods near the holler altogether, walking long, winding day tours to keep distance between themselves and the whispering trees. Yet the sounds persisted, slipping through cracks in windows at night, drifting down chimneys, weaving into dreams, making sure the entire community remembered the night Clara Mae was claimed by a tradition older than any of them could comprehend. The disappearance of the midwife became the moment when fear truly took hold in the holler, for she was not the kind of woman who simply vanished. Old as she was, bones thin as kindling and eyes clouded by age, she still moved with a stubborn certainty, following paths others avoided and tending to births no doctor would come near. People trusted her, even if they did not fully understand her. She had delivered nearly every child for miles, whispered blessings over sickbeds, and knew more about the land's moods than any preacher or sheriff. So when she did not return the morning after Clara Mae's forbidden ceremony, the holler felt the loss immediately. At first, the elders claimed she had simply gone home by another route, perhaps choosing the creek path to avoid the dense brush. But by noon her cabin remained cold, her hearth untouched, her lamp unlit. Neighbors called her name into the trees, receiving only the strange, thin echoes that had plagued the woods since the Hensley ritual. Her absence settled heavily in the minds of those who knew what she had been asked to do that night. They remembered the way she had looked the previous week, uneasy, distracted, murmuring to herself as if arguing with an unseen presence. Some recalled her warning the elders in a rare moment of defiance, telling them the land was no longer willing to carry the weight of their traditions. No one listened. Search parties formed reluctantly. Men walked the familiar trails with lanterns swinging at their sides, their voices cracking as they called her name. The woods felt wrong, the air tight, as if something watched from behind the dense pines. When they reached the clearing where the ceremony had taken place, they found the dirt disturbed in strange circular patterns, as though someone had paced wildly through the night. That alone was unsettling, but what lay near the roots of the oldest oak unsettled them more. The midwife's shawl, a faded brown thing she never left home without, hung torn and tangled among the roots, draped as if placed there by careful hands rather than snagged by accident. It was damp, cold, and streaked with a dark residue no one wished to touch. Whispers spread quickly. Some claimed she had been taken by the same forces that whispered through the trees. Others believed she ran, driven mad by what she had witnessed. A few whispered that she had tried to undo the ceremony's binding words and paid a terrible price. The elders said nothing, offering only tight-lipped reassurances that convinced no one. Mothers locked their doors. Children were forbidden from wandering near the woods. And in the center of it all stood Clara Mae, quiet and pale, her eyes fixed on the tree line as if she alone knew the truth behind the midwife's disappearance, and perhaps feared that the woods were not finished with them yet. The discovery of the family ledger happened by accident, though some would later insist nothing about that morning was coincidence. A traveling salesman, worn from days of walking the narrow mountain roads, sought shelter when a sudden storm rolled over the holler. With thunder chasing him down the ridge, he stumbled toward what he thought was an abandoned shed near the old Hensley property. The structure leaned with age, its roof sagging, its walls splitting open like a long-forgotten wound. Inside, dust hung in the air like fine ash, untouched for decades. He might have left instantly had the storm not trapped him there, forcing him to explore in hopes of finding kindling for a small fire. That was when his boot struck something heavy beneath the floorboards. Curious, he pried up a loose plank, revealing a small, iron-bound box coated in rust. The lock had rotted away, and with a gentle push, the lid creaked open. Inside lay the ledger, its leather cover cracked and darkened with age. The pages were thick, yellowed, and soft at the edges, as though they had been turned countless times by hands that feared damaging what they sought to preserve. As the salesman flipped through the book, he felt an unease crawl up his spine, for the entries were written in a spidery script that felt too deliberate, too careful, as if every word carried weight. Each page listed names, Hensleys, all of them, going back far longer than the holler itself had been settled. Beside every name were dates of birth, strange symbols, and notes written in shorthand only the family seemed to understand. Many of the names were paired, often siblings or cousins, with the same symbol repeated between them, a looping mark that resembled a twisted tree branch. Every so often, a name was crossed out with heavy strokes, the ink darker and fresher than the rest, as though added more recently, as though someone still tended the book long after the shed had fallen into ruin. What disturbed the salesman most was the pattern. Generation after generation, the same names reappeared. The same unions. The same symbols. It was as if the Hensleys had been recording a ritual more than a family history, a tradition intentionally preserved despite the shadows it cast. On one page, a child's name had been circled repeatedly, the ink almost carved into the paper. The date matched a story he had heard the night before at a nearby tavern, about a girl who vanished before her 10th birthday, leaving nothing but a lock of hair and a scream that echoed through the valley. The salesman felt suddenly unwelcome in the shed, as if the ledger's presence alone shifted the air around him. He closed the book carefully, hands trembling, but not before he noticed something that made him freeze. The last entry bore a recent date and two names he recognized from whispered conversations along the road, Clara Mae Hensley and Eli Hensley, bound together by the very same symbol that stained every tragic pairing before them, a symbol that seemed to pulse on the page like something alive. Rumors about Clara Mae's eyes began spreading only a few days after the midwife vanished, though no one could recall exactly when the change first appeared. Some said it happened the morning after the forbidden ceremony, when she stepped out onto the porch in a pale dress and stared into the tree line for nearly an hour without blinking. Others claimed her eyes shifted gradually, darkening more each time she was seen outdoors, as though something inside her was dimming whatever light had once lived there. Before the marriage ritual, Clara's eyes had been a soft, bright blue, unmistakable, almost gentle, even when she was frightened. But after that night in the stone circle, witnesses insisted the blue had drained away, replaced by a murky gray that looked unnatural, like river water stirred by something hidden beneath the surface. People noticed first at the general store, where Clara arrived one morning with Eli trailing quietly behind her. She stepped into the dim light of the aisle, and a young woman stocking shelves gasped as she looked up. Clara's eyes were dull, metallic, lacking any spark of youth or fear or emotion. They seemed older, mismatched to her 13-year-old frame, as though she carried the gaze of someone who had already witnessed too much. The woman swore Clara did not speak a word, but every so often, she paused mid-stride, turning her head slowly toward the windows as if she heard something no one else could. When asked if she was feeling ill, Clara only blinked once, her expression empty, her pupils barely responding to the light. Whispers spread quickly that her eyes now matched the strange color recorded beside certain names in the Hensley ledger, the same misty gray ink marking those who had taken part in the family's darkest traditions. The few who had seen the ledger whispered about it in hushed tones, noting how the symbol linking Clara and Eli was drawn heavier than most, the ink bleeding into the page until it looked almost charred. People couldn't decide if the eye color was a sign, a curse, or some inherited mark that surfaced after the ritual, but the change unsettled them deeply. Mothers tugged their children away when Clara passed. Men avoided looking her in the face. Even Eli seemed wary, glancing at her with a mixture of guilt and confusion, as though he didn't understand what she was becoming. Some believed that Clara's eyes reflected the woods, that the whispering trees had seeped into her, claiming her as their own. A farmer swore he saw her standing at the edge of the forest at dusk, her grey eyes catching the last light in a way that made them appear almost luminous, like embers smouldering in ash. Another witness claimed her pupils flickered, narrowing unnaturally as she stared into the shadows, as if focusing on shapes no one else could see. Whatever the truth was, the holler agreed on one thing: Clara Mae no longer looked like a child. She looked like someone marked, claimed, altered by forces that had been waiting a long time for another Hensley bride to bear their weight, and the changing of her eyes was only the beginning of that transformation. The cellar door in the Hensley cabin had always been a point of unease, even before Clara Mae's marriage, but afterward it became something far darker. The cabin itself was old, built from timber so weathered it had turned almost silver, and beneath its creaking floorboards lay a trapdoor most folks in the holler pretended not to notice. It wasn't just the fact that it was bolted shut with a thick iron lock that drew suspicion, it was the way the family behaved around it. Hensleys came and went without acknowledging its existence, stepping around it with calculated ease, never dropping so much as a coin near it. Children of the family were warned from the time they could walk to stay away from the trapdoor. "Nothing down there for you," the elders would whisper, though their voices always carried an edge of fear rather than discipline. After Clara's forbidden ceremony, the cellar took on a new presence in the household. The lock, once coated in dust from years of neglect, now gleamed as if touched daily. Fresh scratches marked the wood around it, long gouges that hadn't been there before, as though something or someone had been clawing to get out. Eli avoided it entirely, refusing to even look in its direction, which only made the rest of the family more anxious. Clara, however, seemed strangely drawn to it. She passed over the boards with deliberate slowness, her grey eyes lingering on the edges of the trapdoor, as if listening for something beneath. Neighbors who visited the cabin began noticing sounds at odd hours. Late at night, when the mountains settled into their quiet, a faint tapping could be heard under the floorboards. Sometimes it was a slow, rhythmic beat, like knuckles brushing wood. Other times it was frantic, rapid thuds that traveled from one side of the cabin to the other, causing dishes to tremble on shelves. The Hensleys claimed it was rats, but no one believed them. Rats didn't make sounds that resembled muffled breathing. Rats didn't whisper. One evening, a distant cousin claimed she heard a distinct knocking while sitting near the fireplace. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more. A pattern. Almost like someone asking for entry. When she asked Clara about it, the girl tilted her head and replied softly that it had always sounded like that, as though the noise was nothing new to her. The cousin left the cabin pale and trembling, refusing to return. Stories spread throughout the holler that something was trapped beneath the cabin, something that wanted out. Some believed it was the midwife, taken by whatever force lingered in the woods. Others whispered about older Hensley brides, those whose names had been crossed out in the ledger without explanation. A few murmured that the cellar was a final resting place for secrets too dangerous to bury in plain sight. But the most chilling claim came from a man who swore he saw Clara crouched over the trapdoor one dawn, her palm pressed against the wood as if feeling for a pulse. He said she was whispering back. The arrival of the wandering preacher unsettled the holler in a way no outsider ever had, for he walked with the posture of someone who had seen the world's darkest corners and recognized the same shadows in the Kentucky woods. He appeared one gray morning near the riverbank, tall and thin, his coat torn at the sleeves and his boots caked in dried mud from places far beyond the ridge. He carried no Bible, only a worn satchel and a carved wooden cross that looked handmade, unfinished, and oddly heavy for its size. The townsfolk noticed immediately that he moved like a man guided by something other than sight, his head tilting every so often toward the trees as if listening to distant voices. He introduced himself to no one. Instead, he wandered through the holler silently, pausing at fences, dead stumps, and abandoned tool sheds as though searching for something he couldn't name. When he finally spoke, it was to the butcher, who caught him staring at the mountains. The preacher whispered that something unnatural had taken root in the valley, something older than the families who lived there and hungrier than the soil that fed their crops. His voice trembled in a way that didn't match his steady gaze, and the butcher felt an icy dread crawl up his spine. Outsiders occasionally gossiped about the Hensley family, but this man spoke as if he sensed the wrongness rather than knew it. It wasn't long before people learned why he had come. A farmer swore he saw the preacher wandering the ridge at dawn, mumbling prayers that sounded more like warnings. Another claimed the preacher asked him how long the girl with the grey eyes had been bound to the woods. No one understood the question, but everyone knew exactly which girl he meant. Clara Mae had become a silent presence, drifting near the tree line at odd hours, watching the shadows with unblinking stillness. The preacher said he had seen her just after sunrise, barefoot, her dress dusted with dew, whispering as though to someone standing right beside her. Yet he insisted she was alone. The way he said it, though, made it sound like she shouldn't have been. He told the townsfolk that the land around the Hensley cabin carried a stain, a spiritual rot that spread like roots beneath the soil. He claimed the whispers in the trees weren't merely echoes but voices of those wronged, trapped, or bound by rituals never meant for human hands. He spoke of symbols carved into bark, of footprints that vanished mid-trail, of cold spots in the woods where no bird dared sing. When asked how he knew such things, he only replied that the forest itself had told him. The holler took notice because the preacher did not speak like a man chasing rumors, he spoke like someone who had been chased. And though he never accused Clara outright, he watched her with a careful, mournful caution, as if he feared she wasn't just a child caught in a curse, but a doorway to something waiting on the other side of the trees. Eli's disappearance changed the atmosphere of the holler entirely, casting a shadow over the Hensley cabin that no one could ignore. 4 years, the family had been whispered about, known for strange practices and odd disappearances, but nothing had ever happened so quickly, so dramatically. One morning, Eli was simply gone. He had left the cabin before dawn, his boots lined with the same mud from the creek bed that marked the edges of the forest, and had not returned. Clara Mae had been seen standing at the cabin door as the sun rose, her grey eyes scanning the ridge where he had last been seen, silent and still, as if nothing could disturb her composure. The neighbors initially thought he had gone hunting or wandered off like many Hensley boys often did, but when hours turned into a full day, unease began to ripple through the valley. The first signs that something was wrong were subtle. Footprints trailed toward the dense woods but ended abruptly near a copse of twisted oaks. No sign of Eli appeared beyond that, only the imprint of his boots disappearing into the undergrowth. It was as if he had been swallowed by the land itself. Those who ventured close to the edge of the forest reported a strange chill, the kind that prickled the skin and left the hair on the back of the neck standing straight. Some claimed they heard faint, urgent cries, Eli calling, or perhaps the forest mocking, but when they stepped closer, the sound vanished completely. The woods seemed alive in a way that was distinctly unnatural, moving with a consciousness that defied explanation. Neighbors tried to alert the sheriff, but none could describe the woods clearly enough for him to mount a search. The Hensley cabin, normally quiet but for occasional whispers and creaks, now seemed tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Clara Mae remained on the porch much of the day, her expression unreadable, as though she were listening to voices no one else could hear. Her presence became almost spectral, and those who saw her reported feeling watched, as if the girl herself had become part of the forest that had claimed her brother. When Eli's mother entered the woods in desperation, she stumbled across a single muddy handprint smeared across the cabin's front door, as though he had tried to reach back into the safety of the home before vanishing completely. It was not alone. The surrounding soil bore faint impressions of limbs dragging, lines that suggested struggle or resistance, but ultimately led to nothing. The holler whispered that the land itself had taken him, punishing the family for their transgressions. Others believed that Eli had been pulled into the same hidden world Clara seemed to navigate with eerie familiarity. In any case, no one dared speak loudly about the event, for fear that acknowledging it would invite the forest's attention and perhaps ensure Eli was not gone but waiting, unseen, beneath the canopy of twisted pines and shadowed hollows. The torn wedding dress appeared days after Eli's disappearance, a haunting reminder that the events in the Hensley woods were far from ordinary. It was discovered snagged on the jagged thorns of a wild blackberry bush near the edge of the clearing where Clara Mae and Eli had first been wed in secret. The dress, once pristine and white though faded by time, was shredded almost beyond recognition, fabric ripped into long, uneven strips. Its presence alone was unsettling, but what made it truly chilling was the way it seemed impossibly warm, as if someone had only just abandoned it there. Locals who found it reported that it radiated a strange heat that clung to their hands, lingering like the residue of a fever they could not shake. The torn shirt of Eli's was found nearby, caked in mud and partially torn along the seams. Its placement suggested struggle, yet there were no footprints leading away from the bush except those of the people who discovered it. Some who examined the site swore they saw faint impressions in the soil beneath the dress, handprints, not Eli's, as if something heavy had pressed down from above before vanishing entirely. Others insisted that they felt a subtle pulse from the fabric, almost like it was alive, quivering faintly in the early morning wind. When the townsfolk touched it, they said it seemed to draw their gaze, urging them to peer into the darkness beyond the clearing, as if daring them to follow where Eli had gone. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the dress was a warning left by the woods themselves, evidence that whatever had claimed Eli was not finished. Others whispered that Clara Mae had been seen near the bush, her grey eyes flickering in the pre-dawn light, studying the shredded fabric with a strange reverence, as though it contained a memory she alone could read. A few brave souls who tried to approach her said she had not spoken but merely tilted her head and smiled faintly, an expression that sent shivers down spines and left hearts pounding with unease. The site became something of a morbid pilgrimage for the curious, though no one dared linger for long. The thorns seemed sharper, the shadows longer, and the air heavier, as if the forest itself were pressing down to keep watchers away. Those who lingered reported hearing faint, desperate sobs from somewhere deep within the trees, overlaid with whispers that sounded like the echo of the midwife's voice calling out from the night of the forbidden ceremony. Some said the whispers were actually Clara speaking, though her lips did not move, and her gaze remained fixed on the shredded fabric. Even the elders of the holler dared not remove the dress or shirt. They left it where it had fallen, a monument to the Hensley curse, a silent signal that the forbidden union of Clara and Eli had left a mark on the land, one that would not be erased, one that pulsed with life as though the woods themselves had claimed ownership of what remained. The night of the screams arrived like a storm, sudden and suffocating, draping the holler in a darkness so thick it seemed to pulse against the skin. Clouds had swallowed the moon, and the wind carried a bitter chill that pricked exposed flesh. That evening, Clara Mae was seen standing at the edge of the clearing, a small lantern in her hand, its flickering light casting eerie shadows across her pale, narrow frame. Her grey eyes glowed faintly in the dark, unblinking, and she held herself with an unnatural stillness, as if she were both part of the forest and entirely apart from it. The holler held its breath, sensing that something beyond human reckoning was about to unfold. Then came the screams. First, a single, piercing cry that split the night air, sharp enough to make dogs howl and horses rear in their stalls. It was not a human cry alone, it carried a layered resonance, as though many voices were entwined within it, rising and falling like a tide. Seconds later, more joined, echoing through the holler and bouncing off ridges, filling every valley with a sound so raw, so terrified, that even the bravest men dropped to their knees in instinctive prayer or disbelief. Windows rattled, doors shook, and children clutched their mothers' skirts, eyes wide and filled with terror they could not name. People rushed toward the Hensley property despite instinct telling them to stay away. The lantern Clara held bobbed between the trees like a ghost, her silhouette elongated and warped by shadows that seemed to move independently of her. Those who dared approach swore the screams came from all directions at once, impossible to locate, yet unmistakably centered around the cabin and the clearing beyond it. Some claimed they glimpsed movement in the trees, shapes that darted and twisted, too fast and too strange to be human. Others said the wind carried faint whispers beneath the shrieks, voices begging, warning, chanting in a tongue no one recognized. As the night wore on, the sound intensified, rising to a fevered crescendo before abruptly stopping. Silence fell so suddenly it was almost unbearable, thick and expectant, as though the world itself held its breath. When the first brave villagers finally dared step closer, they found Clara Mae alone, the lantern's flame guttering but steady, standing amid the clearing with her grey eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. The torn wedding dress and Eli's shredded shirt lay nearby, but there were no signs of movement, no footprints beyond her own. The holler never recovered from that night. People said the forest had come alive, that the land itself had screamed in judgment. Clara Mae's figure, lantern in hand, became a story whispered to children and repeated at porches, a reminder that the woods still held secrets, still watched, and that some rituals, once performed, could never be undone. That night became the heartbeat of the holler, a pulse that carried the Hensley curse forward, and every scream that echoed through the trees afterward was a reminder that Clara Mae was both the witness and the warning, standing at the center of a darkness that refused to release its hold.